I should have put a plant in the audience. But I do want to thank a lot of our classroom work in diagrams is sponsored by NSF, and Greg Salomon, our program officer, is sitting in the back, so we thank him. And so, yeah, Kristen.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the transfer test where you had the bio diagrams and the geo diagrams. Sorry, I have two questions. Can everybody hear? Do I need this?
Yeah, could you, we're capturing this
Oh, okay.
digitally, so if you could.
Two questions. One is if you could say a little bit more about the transfer task where you had a graph where you had geodiagrams, biodiagrams, if you could say a bit more about that. And then also if you could talk about whether any of you know of research on how students interpret three-dimensional structures conveyed in diagrams like topographic maps or block diagrams, so diagrams that are 2D but convey three-dimensional structure.
Right. So in the smaller scale classroom work that I was talking about, we instructed students using diagrams from their own textbooks. So we're really trying to embed it in their own curriculum, just as we did in the center. Not trying to say, well, we're going to pop into your classroom for a day and have kids make a drawing of a bird wing, which is not relevant to your curriculum, to your scope and sequence. And so we were working in biology units, but we were interested in whether if you teach the students the basics of you should read the caption, you should read the labels. If there are explanations, you should read them in order, which is typically clockwise. You should follow the arrows. Right? I'm seeing the teachers nod because they did this with their kids. And at first, we're surprised that the kids didn't already get this, right? So actually teaching them is a very useful thing. And every teacher we've ever worked with has had this surprise. When we tested them on biology diagrams and also on geology diagrams, we were interested in whether we could get these basic diagram skills to transfer to a new domain. And I would say that it's been uneven when we've been able to do that and when we haven't been able to do that. In terms of the topographic maps, there are people who specialize in that, and I am not one of them. Do you guys want to speak to?
I've done a little bit of research on three-dimensional graphs and topographic displays, and I guess the bottom line is that each of those kinds of displays sort of highlights certain information and not other information. So topographic maps are really good for identifying maxima and minima, but more difficult for people understanding sort of slope. So the distance between the lines represents slope in some sense, but that's very difficult from those. A three-dimensional structural graph is better for that, but of course that includes some information. So it's a trade-off is the basic bottom line.
What I think is interesting about topo maps is that nobody thinks that you could just look at them and get them right away. Unlike these diagrams, which appear to be transparent. I think everybody, except maybe Scoutmasters, but Scoutmasters teach the kids how to read them. Maybe it's cartographers think that that it's just transparent, that you look at it and you know. We didn't talk about this at all, but we also have given kids lots of measures of different spatial abilities and find that different spatial abilities or different tests relate in different ways, both to comprehension and to how kids grow. So there are different measures that are related at pretest than are related to, we usually use residualized gain scores, but looking at, who benefits the most. And sometimes we find these very complex interactions where kids who are high in certain spatial abilities are privileged in certain of our interventions, and kids who are high on different spatial abilities are privileged in other interventions. Is there a question back here? Chris?
For posterity. So I wonder about the tension between reading in the current versus replacing with better. You know, kids would learn math better if they learned it in Chinese than if they learned it in English. English and French and German have ways that they undercut understanding of the place value system, and Chinese is much better for that. But it's kind of a pain to teach everyone Chinese first so they can learn math. So we don't follow that route. But by analogy, one could say, you know, those crazy cladograms that the biologists love, why do we torture all those students with that? There are these other representations that are much more effective, except for later they'll have to learn to read these wacky things, and they'll go to neuroscience where they flip images and left is right and right is left. We thought that'd be a good idea, and all these sorts of things. So where's the trade-off between let's just teach them Chinese and where should we just suffer with the crappy diagrams that are out in the world?
Well, I mean, in part of the answer to your question, the crappy diagrams out in the world, in fact, are more in the textbooks and less in the primary literature in biology. So we actually did an analysis of what's in primary journals, and the primary journals overwhelmingly have the rectangular format cladograms, which are the ones that are easier to understand. It's the textbooks that are tipping in the other direction to have the diagonal format cladogram. So I think there the answer is really clear, is you get rid of the diagonal format cladograms in the textbooks, which actually I know at least in 4 cases we've effectively done based on our research. But I mean, you're right, in some cases you have difficulties that you just have to deal with it, and then I think the answer is, you know, what we've talked about is to identify what those difficulties are and to then say, okay, well, we know that this is what's going to be difficult, and so we need to teach this. And I think part of it is to go in and teach early. So, you know, don't wait until you get to middle school or high school or college where students have all sorts of misconceptions about the way things are, and these misconceptions are really strong because they've had them for 10 years or 15 years or whatever, that in some cases you have to go in and teach the right thing, teach the conventions, teach the relationships, whatever it is, and maybe you need to start in kindergarten or preschool as opposed to, okay, well, now they've got it wrong in 6th grade or 9th grade, and we have to undo.
And I think there's a burden on those of us who are in colleges of education to work with the science ed faculty, the early childhood faculty, to try to convince them that they should teach their pre-service teachers a little bit about this. Priti, did you want to weigh in at all on the graph?
I think everyone should learn Chinese.
There's a question in the back, or a point?
Could you just give, I was intrigued when you said about the individual differences predicting strengths in one area and different individual differences predicting strengths in another. Could you give a really specific example of that in terms of, you know, which skills predicted better outcomes and which didn't?
So where we had the most startling interactions was, this is published in Learning and Instruction, I think March of this year, that when we had students do drawing as part of the intervention, maybe Nora can help me, but mental rotations disadvantaged, the kids who were low on mental rotations were disadvantaged in the drawing condition. And the kids who were, I think, strong on paper folding were disadvantaged in that one. So it was really a complex interaction. The problem is that it's not been a consistent finding across all of our studies, even though we've been working in the same 2 high schools across a large series of studies. So we're a little reluctant to sort of make strong claims. I do think that it puts schools in an interesting bind, because we don't want schools to go out and be giving batteries of spatial abilities to lots of kids, and then be saying, oh, we're going to put you in the Bluebirds group, and we're going to put you in the Orioles group because, you know, you were low on mental rotations, or low on mental rotation and high on paper folding. I think maybe a better way to go, and Dr. Easton can give us his thoughts about this, but from a policy perspective, it would be better to recommend or to think about scaling up interventions that are sort of neutral with regard to spatial abilities, so that if you have an intervention like self-explanation, where it doesn't seem to matter whether a kid is low or high on this spatial measure or that spatial measure, it seems like we've described it in some of our manuscripts as sort of more fair across the board. You guys didn't really talk about spatial, but I know you've done some work with spatial abilities in the graph reading.
Yeah, we've done some work on different individual differences, predicting performance on reading different kinds of graphs, and we do find that different factors correlate with different kinds of graphics. So things that are more working memory demanding are correlated with working memory, as a sort of very simple example of that. Sometimes prior knowledge plays a much bigger role than other times. So definitely there are interactions of ability and format.
So we've found that prior knowledge matters, although not as much as you might expect. So, I mean, I showed you data that our stronger background students have some of the same problems as the weaker background students. And if you look at how people scan diagrams, I didn't present these data, but we have the same patterns in professors as in their students. So prior knowledge, I think, does matter. We've looked at, I think we have one study that we tried giving a couple of different spatial kinds of measures, rotation and visualization, paper folding, without, at least in our domain, in terms of understanding these cladograms, not consistent findings with spatial ability.
There's an amazing repository of literature reviews and recent studies and spatial measures at the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center website. That Nora Newcomb is PI of that center, and Dedry Gentner is also on that center, and there are a number of postdoctoral and doctoral students who are part of that center. So if you're interested in learning more about this relationship between spatial abilities and work with all kinds of visual representations and all kinds of learning in science, it's an amazing website. I think we had one point over here and then another one over here. We have 5 minutes, so we got a good discussion going.
I wanted to go back to the transfer question, and I wondered how particular these understandings are that students can develop about these diagrams. So you showed the mitochondria diagram with the energy moving back and forth with arrows. I'm wondering if you worked with a group of students to understand that diagram, would they then be able to work on a diagram of energy flow in an ecosystem, say, not going into geology, into a separate context, but in biology, would they be able to interpret additional diagrams? How particular, do you have any sense from your research of how particular these learnings are for students?
I think it depends on how we instruct them and how they respond to the instruction. So Dr. Chi will be disappointed, but the students and the teachers complained bitterly about having to do self-explanation. And yet that was one that really did get us better transfer. So simply doing the conventions doesn't seem to transfer that much. Coordinating text and diagrams did seem to transfer. And what's interesting is that was one where the students didn't complain a lot. So I think doing this work in schools, it's a tough balance. And again, I would encourage you to talk to the teachers who are part of the center about how do the students respond when we ask them to do these kinds of tasks. And I think that there's a very delicate balance that you have to find as you do this work. Teachers being confident enough to push their students some, but not push them so hard that they push back and refuse to do anything. I do think that in some of our work, when the students are working on the computer with this CogSketch software, it's not designed like a game, but it may be sort of game-like enough that they're trying to get the little robot to pop up and say, your sketch looks good to me. So maybe there is a piece of framing this work, this hard intellectual work that they have to do, that pushes them just enough that they actually do it. We'll take one more, Dr. Fishman.
So this is a question that probably could be asked of every single session, but there's a certain applied directionality here of knowledge flow from basic science to the classroom implementation. And I'm just curious what you have observed that might flow back the other way. How looking at some of these cognitive science findings implemented in curriculum used in real classrooms might change the way we understand or interpret the cognitive science.
I would say that a lot of it comes down to what we were just talking about in terms of the classroom context and teacher kids, and that, what did Anne Brown, she used that, the buzzing, blooming confusion, that if you have these very compliant European undergrads who are being paid 15 euros to look at some representation of a Wärmepumpe, which is like some kind of heat pump, that, you know, a sixth grader in the average Philadelphia school is coming from a really different place. And that work around relevance, work around engagement, which is a term that's been used a lot of different ways in the research literature, but just getting them to spend time on task. Those are things that I think we need to attend to more. Nora wants to.
I want to offer another example, because what Jennifer is talking about is sort of how you implement in real classrooms, which I think is, I mean, it's very important, but it's not exactly what you asked. And in terms of a challenge for cognitive science, one that is personal to me because I'm now doing a lot of research on it, and the center is, and Elise Resnick, who's sitting right beside you, is the challenge of scaling and the challenge of understanding really big and really small space and number, the nano dimension, the geologic time scale, and so forth. I think we have cognitive science tools and principles that can be brought to bear on scaling and understanding these extreme magnitudes. But I had never understood it as an interesting topic in cognitive science before we started to do this work.
I would add just two other very quick things. Okay.
I was just going to add that one of the things that the classroom work has informed our work is that what the rate limiting factors are frequently quite different out in the real world than they are in the laboratory. So we find factors such as dispositions, like attitudes towards difficult thinking, or engagement, attentional processes. All of these factors tend to play a much bigger role out in the classroom and gets us back into thinking in the laboratory. So how can we address these issues as opposed to the cognitive perceptual issues that we were asking about earlier? So,
And I don't want us to run too far over time, but the lab studies tend to use one researcher-developed representation. We're going into the classroom and working over 12 weeks with dozens of representations from the textbooks. I think a second difference is that there's been very, very little attention to inference in a lot of the lab studies because the representations are so simplified and the tasks that students are given don't require them to make these inferences. And I think that's a very, very ripe area for cognitive science, is what is the nature of the inferences? Are they spatial? Are they local? Are they global? Are they elaboration? Are they elaborations? And to more precisely describe, to both do studies where students have to make inferences, and then to describe the kinds of inferences that they have to make, and to describe the kinds of inferences that they are actually trying to make or are making. So I've gone over time, but thank you very much, and this is a great discussion. I hope we can keep this going on.